further ado, I'm going to introduce our first speaker in this session, Alice Correa. Alice Correa is an art historian. Her research examines late 20th century British art with a specific focus on African, Caribbean and South Asian diaspora artists. In 2017, she was a mid-career fellow at the Paul Mellon Centre for the Study of British Art, where she initiated her ongoing research project articulating British Asian art histories. Her articles and reviews have appeared in Art History, British Art Studies, British Visual Culture, and NK Journal of Contemporary African Art. She is the chair of trustees of Third Text and co-chair of the British Art Network's Black British Art Research Group. She has worked at the Tate, the Government Art Collection, and the Universities of Sussex and Salford. She's currently working as a research curator at Touchstones Rochdale on a major project examining the history of Rochdale Art Gallery during the 1980s. Without further ado, I'll invite Alice to share screen and to appear via video if she is willing. Hello, Alice.
Hi, can you see my screen?
That's looking great. So I'll hand over to you now.
Okay, great, thank you. Thank you, Amy and Catherine, for the invitation to speak today. I'll just say from the outset, I've had an unstable internet connection, but hopefully it will be okay for now. Right. Why is my... Okay. So in 1983, a group of loosely connected women joined forces with the aim to create from scratch a magazine unlike any other produced in Britain at that time. In a recent conversation, Amina Patel, one of the Mukti Collective, recalled meeting Meera Saran and discussing how she felt South Asian women from Britain were not being represented in or by the British media. At that time, Patel was working as a media resources officer at the Centre for Urban Educational Studies, set up by the ILEA, the Inner London Education Authority. In this post, Patel developed teaching packs and materials for teachers to use in schools. And specifically, she developed teaching materials to support the teaching about racism and supplied materials to aid the diversifying of the curriculum across all subjects. So she had a pre-existing interest in diverse voices. Although it remains vague exactly of how everyone got together, Patel recalls that a number of the collective, the Mukti Collective, were teachers, but none had any experience of journalism or magazine production. Nonetheless, a core group of women came together to set up the magazine. Collective members met in central London every Monday at 6 p.m, and Patel recalls that meetings were heated, and as time progressed, there were huge differences of opinion, which also filtered onto the pages of the magazine. Despite obstacles, however, in June 1983, the magazine was launched. Addressing its readership as sisters, in the editorial for the first issue, the Mukti Collective set out its reasoning for starting the magazine. Quote, "We wanted to write about the many aspects of our lives, the good and the bad. We wanted to read about our sisters' struggles against oppressions we face as women, Black people and workers. Our experiences are almost absent from the media controlled by white men. If stories about our lives do appear, they concentrate on us as victims of our culture. Also, the Black press rarely gives us space on its pages. We feel that the white feminist press has until recently ignored us and often only print articles that again make our culture a problem without understanding the need to hold on to our culture in a racist society. We must start to write our own stories, create our own pictures, share our struggles and our triumphs." The Mukti ran from 1983 to 1987, producing 7 issues over 4 years. Each issue had a DIY aesthetic, was A4 in size of 24 pages each. Together, the collective, with friends and associates, wrote and typed up articles, used Letraset, made drawings, and photocopied the magazine. Arguably, Mukti took the form and vocal tone of a zine rather than a glossy magazine such as Spare Rib, and with its range of voices and perspectives, and different font types and sizes, the magazine had a particular visual look and diverse outlook. Nonetheless, Mukti's target audience were women of South Asian heritage, a community which included people from different nations, religions, social classes, and castes. From the outset, though, this magazine had aspirations to be accessible and open to all, and initially it was produced in 6 languages: English, Hindi, Gujarati, Bengali, Urdu, and Punjabi, although this undertaking would ultimately prove difficult to sustain. Overall, the magazine sought to disseminate information, particularly in relation to women's legal rights, provide a safe space for self-expression, and to talk openly about taboo subjects. Mukti tried to foster a sense of kinship, a safe space, a community where discussions could be had and experiences shared in a non-judgmental space, and where there were common shared experiences. From issue 1, there were clear sections that would structure later issues, including local and international news, a legal advice page, which you can see here from issue 1, which is about what women need to know in the wake of the 1982 Nationality Act, and what South Asian women who have yet to secure British citizenship, what they need to do to ensure their long-term security in the UK. So as well as those legal advice pages, there was a health page, and Amina Patel recalls heated debates as to whether the magazine should include recipes, with the decision coming down firmly on the side of no. Editorials and the main features were written by the collective, and although articles were sent in by later issues, articles were sent in by readers. And issues contained a mix of longer discursive essays, think pieces, explanatory texts, short poems, graphic drawings and photographs, and articles addressed such topics as the strictures of arranged marriage, deportations and citizenship rights, female sexual fulfillment, perceptions of lesbianism in South Asian cultures, incest and child sexual abuse. In the editorial for issue 2, which you can see on the top of the screen, the collective recounted how, on receipt of feedback for issue 1, it was decided that each issue should have focus on a particular theme, with subject-specific articles positioned alongside regular features. And these themed issues were, in order, the family, sexuality, work, education, racism and prejudice, and the last issue was focused on housing. As I've said, the magazines contained a diversity of voices, and consensus was not necessarily what the magazine was aiming at. But nonetheless, it's evident through the editorials and the chosen content that the magazine did have a particular political standpoint that was anti-Thatcherite, anti-authoritarian, anti-patriarchal, anti-colonial, and anti-imperialist. And I'm sure there are others that could be added to that list. Now, to give some context, in April 1970, the Observer newspaper noted, quote, "Any Asian careless enough to be walking the streets alone at night is a fool." Racially motivated street violence, commonly known as Paki bashing, was a regular occurrence, as were arson attacks on houses and businesses throughout the 1970s. The police response to attacks on South Asian victims was characterized by an unwillingness to afford protection, delays and inadequate investigations, treating the victim as the aggressor, and subjecting victims to continued harassment and persecution. Although many of the most public examples of South Asian protests were undertaken by men, South Asian women were also engaged in social protests. So, for example, South All Black Sisters, established in 1979, addressed the specific needs of Black and Asian women, particularly focused on achieving justice for victims of domestic and sexual abuse. and Avtar Bra has noted that by the 1980s, the political activism of Asian young people hit the headlines as they adopted a highly visible and militant stance against racial oppression. And I'm just showing you here a few of the really useful source materials for those who are interested. So given the diversity of the South Asian diasporic community in Britain, the collective was careful to include Muslim, Hindu, and Bengali voices within the magazine, and notably condemned the Indian and Pakistani governments, and indeed those of Bangladesh and Sri Lanka in equal measure. In the magazine's coverage of activism in the subcontinent, reports of militant protest, and at times it condoned violence when enacted in self-defense. In highlighting issues Indian women fought in '82, in issue 1, using source materials from women's magazines produced in India, those were Manushi, Mayatri, and Eve's Weekly, the collective seemed to be asserting the notion that if our sisters back home can protest, we can protest too, that there was a shared sisterhood and a shared international struggle. So Mukti then was part of a wider generational shift which sought to produce unapologetic and powerful writing and visual art that expressed the particular experiences of being female and South Asian in Britain, where space was not taken up having to explain cultural norms, but where space could be given to personalized subject positions. And what you've got on your screen here is a page of an autobiographical text by a woman called Uma, who shares her experiences of coming out and living as a lesbian in issue 3, which was the issue on sexuality. So the heterogeneity of voices found in Mukti was in stark contrast to the lingering British colonial ideology that cast South Asian women as abjectly submissive, that was found within the mainstream press. And despite clear evidence to the contrary, South Asian women were regularly framed in the British press as politically inactive, shy, and powerless. And again, the two little images that I've highlighted, I just wanted to flag that Mukti also used humor, and that was really part of its ethos, that although they were dealing with really serious issues, they wanted to have a lightness of touch as well, and show that women had a range of subject positions and could laugh at themselves as well. But yet regressive views were perpetuated on the British media through a proliferation of imperial images on UK TV and in the cinematic media throughout the early 80s, including, for example, the film A Passage to India and the ITV series The Jewel in the Crown. And in issue 1, Amina Patel discussed the portrayal of South Asian women on British television, noting that, quote, the prospect of an arranged marriage seems to be the only subject matter which allows Asian women on screen, while also highlighting that in, quote, in newspapers and magazines, we are almost invisible. Our militancy on strikes such as Grumwicks was treated as a novelty until it became a national trade union cause. Later in issue 1 is an equally scathing review of Ishmael Merchant's The Courtesans of Bombay, a 1983 docudrama broadcast on Channel 4 in January 1983. Merchant's film was a semi-fictional depiction of the courtesans in a particular area of Bombay who lived there, in which none of the protagonists were given the opportunity to articulate their lives in their own words. The article was written by the Birmingham South Asian Women's Group, and what they particularly took umbrage at was the fact that this was broadcast on Channel 4. We've already had discussions today about Channel 4, but what they queried was why Channel 4 would broadcast a film that was made by a wealthy man who was well established within the film industry, who had initiated this film by his own admission. The impetus of this film was his own eroticized fascination with the women who he had seen as a teenager in Bombay. Although we've talked about Channel 4 catering to marginalized audiences, there's still a backlash against exactly what Channel 4 was broadcasting in the name of diversity. So these derogatory and orientalizing images of South Asian womanhood were in striking contrast to the image on the cover of the first issue, and indeed the smaller visual ident of the protesting woman with her arm raised and her fist clenched. What's important about these early issues of Mukti and their call for South Asian women to tell their own stories and create their own pictures was that they predate better known academic articles decrying the popular media, and notably predate the 1984 issue of Feminist Review, the special issue Black Voices, One Chant, Many Voices, One Chant, Black Feminist Perspectives. So, although better known today for her brightly coloured pop imagery and her incredible winter commission at Tate Britain earlier this year, whilst a student at the Slade, Shaila Kumari Burman's work addressed socio-political concerns, including social deprivation and the rise of the police state and the troubles in Northern Ireland. Although she was never an official member of the Mukti Collective, Burman regularly assisted the magazine's production, helping with layouts and designs. Her illustration adorns the front cover of the last issue, which also contains her article on shared ownership as a way of purchasing your own home. Burman's Militant Women, created in 1982, presents photographic reproductions of women road builders in India and women protesting the pass law in apartheid South Africa. Collectively, this presentation of international female struggle may be regarded as a visual counterpart to the articles and concerns of Mukti. So, for example, in issues 1 and 2, we find reports on Nirmala, a renowned feminist and revolutionary freedom fighter who became the first woman to be arrested in 1982 under Sri Lanka's infamous Prevention of Terrorism Act. For many in Sri Lanka, particularly, her arrest indicated the growing support from the intelligentsia for armed revolutionary struggle advanced by the Tamil Tiger movement. And as Alexandra Kokoli has recently noted with regard to Burman's Militant Women, anti-militarism and non-violence do not necessarily go hand in hand. And I'd suggest we might say the same about the ethos of Mukti. Indeed, in issue 1, we see a report contextualizing the violent clashes between National Front members and Asian youth in Newham in September 1982, and the ways in which the local schools and police were complicit in allowing racist attacks on Asian school children to take place. Titled Self-Defense, the article outlines events which led to the arrest of the Newham 8 in 1981. And this is followed by a piece of creative writing titled Riot, which appears to be a retelling of the arson attack on the Hamborough Tavern on Southall Broadway in 1981, which was burnt down by South Asian youth in response to a racist punk band playing there. Now, Newham appears multiple times throughout Mukti as a hotspot for racist attack. And in the issue 6, which featured was on racism and prejudice, there's an article about the arrest of 7 Asian boys following a fight with plainclothes policemen on the 7th of April, 1984, which led to visible and vocal public protest. A photograph taken by Mumtaz Karimji of the protest rally in support of the Newham 7 was published in this article. Karimji exhibited regularly throughout the 1980s, and as a self-taught independent photographer, she made significant contributions as an artist, writer, and curator to the aesthetic and political debates around race, gender, and sexuality taking place during the 80s. And indeed, throughout Mukti's run, Karimjee contributed articles on her employment experience within higher education in issue 4, and reflections on the terms Black and Asian in issue 6. Other photographs by her featured in issues 3 and 4. I single out the photograph of the New M7 protest because it speaks across issues of Mukti and links up articles on the abuse of police powers, racism, and collective action that featured within different issues. The image itself was part of a series commissioned by the GLC Race Equality Unit for the 1986 exhibition Reflections on the Black Experience, staged at the Brixton Art Gallery. In that exhibition, Karimjee's photographs were presented as records of the Bangladeshi community in Whitechapel. And in that context, the image of the protest march is one of many. But I think its singularity in Mukti is what's really striking and powerful. The penultimate feature of the final issue of Mukti, published in 1987, was the magazine's only full artist's page. Under the title, She Loved to Breathe, Pure Silence, are 2 photographs by Zarina Bimji, with accompanying text in capital letters. Above these components is a short description of the work of art, explaining that it comprises 8 images, which are presented in pairs, back-to-back, sandwiched between sheets of perspex. The text goes on to explain that the panels are hung from the ceiling at eye level, on the floor below is sprinkled with mirchi and haldi, chili powder and turmeric. Now, discussions of She Loved to Breathe, Pure Silence, both at the time it was made and subsequently, has focused on the 4th panel, which contains a sheet of muslin and a pair of latex gloves. Printed on the muslin is a reproduction of the British Home Office visa stamp, and the combination of the gloves and the visa stamp has meant that the work has, in large part, been regarded as a commentary on the controversial practice of virginity testing in the 1970s and early 80s. Such was the paranoia surrounding non-white migration to Britain. South Asian women were regarded with particular suspicion by British immigration officers, who believed that many were fraudulently participating in arranged marriages in order to obtain a British passport. Internal medical examinations undertaken on new arrivals at Heathrow Airport and elsewhere sought to determine whether women were virgins or not, and the test results would determine the woman's right to enter the UK. I have previously discussed this work through the experiences or the emotions of displacement, fear, and loss of power, where images of abandoned shoes resonate with a presence now transposed or vanished. The shoes being fragments of unspoken testimony available to us in the form of tentative evidence. And Bimji has received much praise for the lyricism and visual poetry of her work and the ways that she gestures to stories through her use of materials and metaphor. However, thinking about She Loved to Breathe, Pure Silence within and through the context of Mukti, I'm also struck by another emotion present, but somehow little discussed in the wider discussion of the work, and that emotion being anger. In 1992, in an interview published in her exhibition catalogue, I Will Always Be Here, Bimji stated that she, quote, would like people to feel uncomfortable with my work. I'm exploring the possibility of deep layers of anger and how important anger is. The text in the final panel describes the discriminatory experiences of South Asian migrants, specifically South Asian women, and it reads, each morning at 5 a.m. they scrubbed the floor. Someone offered her a day's work. These white people laughed at their Indianness, shouted Paki, Apna, Beno, sucked their teeth, dismissing them. What this text tells us is that this is not simply a general description of a South Asian experience. Apna Beno translated means our sisters. So Bimji is speaking specifically about South Asian women and specifically about women with whom she has a shared sisterhood. So returning to the theme of militant women, the presence of the chili powder and turmeric in the installation of the artwork is critical to the understanding of it as a whole. For while the suspended panels speak to degradation, fear, and violations, the scattered spices should properly be understood as a fight back. And in 2012, Bimji recalled that faced with far-right violence opposition in Leicester, quote, "We decided there had been enough Paki bashing. We took the law into our own hands. In our defense, we threw red chili powder at the National Front." So this is a work in progress, and I still have lots to think through about Mukti. But as some concluding thoughts, why is Mukti important? What can we learn from it? And how can it help us contextualize the artwork made by South Asian women artists at the time? I think it's a really important magazine. It gave a voice to a community of women who didn't have access to or weren't appropriately represented in mainstream media and visual culture. It offered advice and counsel, and it provides evidence of what were the key issues, the key social and political issues that were of concern to this community within Britain. I think in and of itself, it's also important evidence of a grassroots feminist action, and provides evidence of important debates that were taking place outside of what we might describe as a mainstream feminist forums. So that's where I'll leave it, and thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Alice. That was really wonderful. Yeah, it was great to hear about those kind of occurrences of sisterhood appearing all through the issues and then through the work. And yeah, I mean, there's lots to unpack, and it seems even in the adverts, I saw some congratulations from Southall Black Sisters and Spare Rib, which would be really interesting to think through. So thanks for that. So it's now time to introduce our next speaker, Jennifer Sarathi, who is a PhD candidate in art history at the CUNY Graduate Center in New York. Her doctoral research addresses artistic interventions in rural and urban landscapes in the 1960s and 70s in Britain. Her work considers the impact of the fall of empire on representations of the land, drawing parallels between representations of space and contentious post-colonial debates over borders and citizenship. Using the landscape to historically and thematically connect a wide range of artists and media, her writing establishes a dialogue between the London avant-garde, feminist activism, and early Black British art. Her chapter, Remapping the Public Sphere, Conceptual Art in 1970s London, is forthcoming in the volume Charting Space, the Cartographies of Conceptual Art, which is due out from Manchester University Press this year, which we look forward to reading. So now I'll hand over to Jennifer, who will present a paper titled Feminist Collectivism in and Out of Art World Spaces. Jennifer. That looks great, but I can't hear you.
There we go, I'm unmuted now.
Oh, wonderful.
Okay. Thank you, Amy and Katherine, for including me in this fantastic conference. And a quick thank you to Prue Stevenson and Susie Mackey and Michael Ann Mullen for sharing their experiences with me. This presentation is part of ongoing research and examines the postal art event and exhibitions by Feministo, Activist Posters of the Sea Red Women's Workshop, and Who's Holding the Baby by the Hackney Flashers. And sorry, I'm just trying to go back to my first screen for some reason. It synced me up in the wrong spot. Right. By the Hackney Flashers to understand.
Sorry, we can't see your screen anymore.
Oh, sorry. This is why. Let me try again. Sorry about that.
Thank you.
Yeah. Okay, is that better?
That's
Okay.
great.
And Who's Holding the Baby by the Hackney Flashers, to understand how the collective production and circulation of feminist media within both institutional and alternative spaces was essential to the establishment of a feminist public sphere in 1970s Britain. I'm drawing attention to the importance of circulation of feminist counter media to the political project of the women's liberation movement. I think I'm echoing a lot of what's being covered in the 3 days of this conference there. I consider how each project established a parallel discursive arena, to use feminist scholar Nancy Fraser's description, where women invented and circulated, I quote, counter discourses to formulate oppositional interpretations of their identities, interests, and needs. I also briefly chart the ways in which these networks of circulation intersected with institutions and grassroots activism to determine how feminist collectives in and out of the art world created and disseminated alternative representations of gendered experience. So to begin, Feministo's postal art event demonstrates how experiences of domestic isolation were shared within a sympathetic network, and how models of consciousness raising were applied to new methods of art making and aesthetics. The event began as a personal correspondence between Kate Walker and Sally Gollop, who exchanged handmade artworks mailed through the post. After 1974, the event expanded to involve a wide network of women across Britain, establishing a long-distance visual discussion that combated a shared sense of domestic isolation through the creation of artworks and their circulation through the post. And given the restrictions of the postal system and the living and working conditions of the participating women, the objects produced, like those seen here, were mostly small scale, created from materials around the home, often using domestic craft skills such as knitting and crochet, not typically associated with fine art, such as the crocheted sandwiches seen here by Sue Richardson. As Richardson's witty lunch plates exemplify, many of the postal artworks meditated on the psychological experience of being a woman and a mother. Here on the bottom of the red plate, butterflies are bound to crocheted sandwich bread smothered by more decorated bread slices, suggesting the repression of Richardson's freedom due to the constant and monotonous need to prepare food for her son, to use her own description. While the postal art event marks an important coalescence of individuals to form a networked collective public, I'm most interested in how exhibitions brought the concerns and alternative aesthetics of the postal art event into public discourse. Postal artworks were exhibited in 5 British locations as portrait of the artist as a young woman or as a housewife at the ICA. The final exhibition at the ICA London being held in 1977, which included a staggering 300 artworks. Although the exhibitions evolved with each presentation, the general format was organized around tableaus of domestic spaces littered with small handmade objects that had been exchanged by participants of the postal art event. The exhibitions disclosed the immensely personal exchanges of the participants, enforcing a new feminist aesthetic based in craft and domestic experience to challenge the male-dominated world of fine art and the rarefied spaces of the institutional art world. The exhibitions also asserted the private realm of the domestic within public space, entering it into both social and artistic discourse as a political act. Rosika Parker recorded that, I quote, "Not all the women in Feministo wanted to risk showing the work in public, but most believe it is politically important. They are, after all, fighting both the art world and sexism by bringing domestic imagery into the open. This fraught process of making private domestic life and trauma visible was made more palpable using partitions, doors, windows, and mirrors within the exhibitions that literally destabilized the boundaries between domestic and public space. Although the dominant bourgeois public sphere most famously conceptualized by Jürgen Habermas, historically maintained a strict separation between private and public concerns. One of feminism's main challenges to public discourse was its insistence that the personal is political. While this involved the insertion of private experience into the public sphere, it also necessitated a challenge to publicly formulated representations of female sexuality and domesticity. In contrast to popular images of a model housewife and domestic bliss, Portrait of the Artist as a Housewife presented what Hazel Elizabeth Frizzell described as a domestic hell that included a flesh collage, a rape box, Lynn Austin's bubble bath suicide, and a refrigerator seen here with Kathy Nicholson's abject, butchered, and bleeding female bodies wrapped in plastic. These effective objects and installations represented the hidden violence, depression, and rage that often define women's experience in the home. These forceful presentations evoked a strong public outcry, with visitors describing the artists as miserable bitches and the bitter, twisted nature of the show that was deemed unsuitable for children by the Northwest Arts Association. These reactions could be seen as a failure for the project to convince its audience. However, scholars such as Sayla Ben-Habib have argued that conflict is essential to a democratic public sphere, with alternative discourse often experienced as a violent, disruptive force. C-Red's Women Workshop was a feminist poster-making collective based in London that was equally concerned with making visible the realities of gendered experience in a manner that challenged stereotypical representations of women in the media. Founded by Prue Stevenson, Julia Franco, and Susie Mackey, C-Red came to involve the collaborative work of more than 40 women, producing an impressive archive of posters, buttons, and calendars between 1974 and the early 1980s. The print workshop was initially based out of the Camden Tenants Association until 1975, when the front window was smashed in response to the posters on display. The collective moved to the Radnor Terrace squat that we've heard about on previous days of the conference on South Lambeth Road, with Sarah Jones joining as a core member at that time. And finally, the group established a more permanent space in Elife Yard in South London in 1977. As seen in these examples here, C-Red's diverse membership resulted in posters that covered a wide range of critiques and causes of the women's liberation movement. C-Red also produced visual materials for other women's groups and offered their facilities as a hub for women to learn to make posters to promote their own causes. And the poster here on the top right, and I apologize it's so small, Participate in Our Struggle, for instance, was created with 2 political refugees from Colombia and Chile to call for international support in their protest of right-wing military dictatorships in Latin America that disappeared thousands of women and children. As with Portrait of the Artist as a Housewife, C-Red's A Woman's Work Is Never Done presents a kind of 24-hour hell, featuring the immobilized image of a woman caught in a never-ending cycle of domestic work, childcare, and monotonous factory labor. In both halves of the image, a male figure monitors her progress through a window, evidencing the ever-present pressure of patriarchal domination. On the left, a television screen features a busty female figure that captivates the woman's idle husband, who is oblivious to his wife's struggles. Other posters more forcibly revealed the systemic factors that shaped and reinforced this gendered experience. In Disc Jockey, for example, a housewife with curlers in her hair is haunted by the figure of a popular DJ, and his morning jingle, I quote, "In the kitchen, magic moments, pretty things, be young and beautiful if you want to be loved. Are you our perfect mom? Shop around, tell me your secrets, girl talk." The dominant counter message, the state and sexist advertising cause illness, make clear how these posters were intended to function as empowering, consciousness-raising tools that simultaneously challenged stereotypical representations of women in the media. While many members of the workshop had formal artistic training, the posters were intended to be ephemeral and functional works of agitprop. Its members remained skeptical of art and of art institutions, instead using their skills to critique and reformulate visual representations of women as part of a grassroots activist practice. As opposed to the delicate and meticulously crafted artifacts of the postal art event, C-Red employed silkscreen printmaking as a cheap and mobile process that could succinctly communicate a political message. In this, they were influenced by posters of the Atelier Populaire produced during the May '68 Paris uprising, posters of the Chinese Cultural Revolution, and by posters created by Black and Chicano women's liberation groups in the United States. C-Red's posters were widely circulated by mail order or by request from radical bookshops, and at women's liberation conferences where women could buy their posters or design their own at mobile printing stations. The collective also inserted their works in public spaces by fly posting and through the use of their posters and logo in public protests as seen here, enhancing the visibility of their feminist discourse. C-Red Women's Workshop was also remarkable in their early acknowledgement of the restrictions of their own subject positions as middle-class white women. Women Unite and Don't Let Racism Divide Us provide powerful anti-racist sentiments of solidarity while also exhibiting a very early awareness of the inadvertent bracketing of subcultures and minority groups within the feminist counterpublic and the tendency to universalize experience within the feminist movement in Britain in the 1970s. Rather than just representing these issues, members of C-Red actively sought alternative perspectives and collaborators from outside groups and women of color. Black Women Will Not Be Intimidated, here on the right, is one such example, created in collaboration with Kehinde James, who joined the collective in 1979. The poster features an evocative montage of photographic imagery that documents the complicated status of Black women in Britain as post-colonial immigrants, workers, mothers, and as community activists. C-Red exemplifies the ways in which the women's movement formed wholly alternative collective networks for the production and display and distribution of countermedia. The creation of a grassroots organization outside of art world and state-run institutions may suggest an empowered form of feminist separatism. However, as Nancy Fraser has written, the concept of a counterpublic militates in the long run against separatism because it assumes an orientation that is publicist. Insofar as these arenas are publics, they are by definition not enclaves. To interact discursively as a member of a public, subaltern or otherwise, is to disseminate one's discourse into ever-widening arenas. The early attack against the Camden Tenants Association shop window was only one indication of the hostility aroused by the public display of C-Red's posters. In 1982, the Alife Yard headquarters was brutally vandalized by the National Front, who placed neo-Nazi stickers on the front door and ransacked the printing workshop. They cut the phone wires, stole equipment, poured ink over the machinery, and urinated on the mail. While this violent and aggressive act was distressing, it marks, in retrospect, the success of C-Red's feminist publicity. C-Red's approach to alternative feminist media can be aligned with the goals of the socialist, feminist, photographic collective, the Hackney Flashers, and their project Who's Holding the Baby from 1978. The Hackney Flashers was organized in 1974 by photographer Joe Spence and Neil Martinson and came to involve collaborators from a wide range of backgrounds, including Ann Decker, Sally Greenhill, Liz Heron, Gerda Jagger, Michael Ann Mullen, Maggie Murray, Christine Roche, and Julia Vellicott. Their later project, Who's Holding the Baby, was a series of 29 photo montages on panels exhibited in local venues, including community centers, bookshops, and other alternative spaces. The panels, which mixed photographs, text, advertising clippings, and cartoons, were intended as moldable agitprop, much like C-RED's posters, and indeed, both Joe Spence and Michael Ann Mullen were briefly members of C-RED in 1974. Who's Holding the Baby involved an 18-month investigation of parents and workers at the communally run Market Nursery in Hackney, South London, and the local campaign for 24-hour childcare. As the term Flashers implies, the project sought to make visible the private experiences of childcare and domestic labor, affirming their relevance to public discourse and state policy. This impetus is well illustrated by this photo montage, where a hole in a brick wall reveals a working class mother doing washing while her children eat around a small kitchen table. The exterior of the wall is marked with graffiti, spray painted by the collective, with an image of a baby rising out of its pram to demand a free nursery. The poster literalizes the making visible of private domestic experience within the public realm, tearing down the wall that divides the two, but orients this private experience in direct relation to the lack of adequate state-sponsored childcare. Exemplifying the tone of the project, the poster urges women to stand up for your right rather than accepting the prevailing status quo. Each panel of Who's Holding the Baby illustrates a different facet of feminist critique, presenting documentary photography of women workers and representations of women in advertising, along statistics regarding childcare and reports on the psychological conditions of housewives. Together, the panels provide a multifaceted account of how childcare, women's labor, and domestic experience are inherently tied to capitalism, state policy, and the representations of women in popular culture. These topics frame the more personal testimonials of women participants from the Hackney Nursery, like that seen here from Jan Livingstone, mirroring the experience of consciousness-raising groups by allowing viewers to identify with the conditions and experiences of the women involved in the nursery collective. Although the panels detail the nearly impossible position of women and mothers, they urge the viewer to combat their own isolation and lack of state support through similar forms of collective protest and grassroots activism. As with C-RED's posters, Who's Holding the Baby was never intended for an art audience, and its eventual inclusion in John Tagg's Hayward exhibition, 3 Perspectives on Photography in 1979, was strongly debated within the group, leading to its dissolution in 1980. While some members framed the project in relation to the history of photography, pitting it against the male-dominated art world and decisive moment photography, others saw their efforts as strictly a representational form of political protest that was intentionally circulated outside of the hallowed art world and its limited public. This conflict between the work as a form of grassroots activism and its inclusion within the mainstream art world continues to animate the history of the project, as has been detailed by my fellow panelist, Victoria Horn. To conclude, these 3 projects illustrate some of the diverse terrains occupied by feminist collectives in 1970s Britain, as they sought to circulate feminist countermedia. While Feminista used gallery spaces to enact a politicized critique of gendered art making and representation, C-RED Women's Workshop and the Hackney Flashers remained highly skeptical of art and art world institutions, preferring to disseminate their work within alternative spaces. I suggest, nevertheless, that their approaches need to be examined together to assess the full political impact of feminist collectivism. While it is tempting to valorize grassroots organization over art world institutions, given the ability for institutions to absorb and neutralize political discourse, I argue that the extension of feminist publicity within a range of institutional and alternative spaces was central to what scholar Rita Felsky describes as, I quote, the public process of revising or refuting male-defined cultural and discursive frameworks. Felsky's description of the women's movement as a structural chameleon seems apt here. describing how the feminist public sphere necessarily existed within both grassroots infrastructure and within existing institutions. Viewed together then, these projects demonstrate how the women's liberation movement in 1970s Britain occupied multiple spaces to extend feminist critiques, enacting a variety of cultural strategies, from radical exhibition making to the circulation of agitprop materials to reinforce the oppositional potential of a feminist public sphere. Thank you.
Thank you, Jennifer. Thanks, that's great. So we now have opportunity to take a very quick break to sort of step away from the screen and rest our eyes before the final two papers in this panel. So I'd like to invite everyone to take 5 or 6 minutes and return at 4:20 for Flora Dunster's paper. Thank you. I hope everyone's coming back to their screens now. So I'm going to jump right in and introduce our next speaker, who is Flora Dunster. Flora is a writer and researcher working on queer and feminist British photography in the 1980s and 90s. She lectures on art history, critical theory and photography at institutions across the UK. And in 2019, she completed a PhD titled Hurled Toward the Future, The Queer Subjunctive in British Lesbian Photography 1987 to 1996. As a 2020 Paul Mellon postdoctoral fellow, she's adapting this research for publication. And her other recent publications include the essay, Do You Have a Place? A Conversation with Sunil Gupta in Third Text 2021, which just came out, and a chapter on the pamphlet series Lesbians Talk is forthcoming in an edited collection on feminist and queer activism in the 1980s from SUNY Press. And so it's my great pleasure to welcome Flora to now share screen and get underway.
1 moment. Thank you, Amy and Katherine, for organizing this conference, which it's been great to kind of follow all 3 days. And I guess thank you as well if you stuck through all of those 3 days and made it to this final panel. And thank you as well to the people who are doing live captioning, which has been really great. So what I'm presenting today isn't so much new research as it is a different angle or sort of way into the book which I'm writing, which centers on Tessa Boffin and Della Grace Volcano, amongst other queer and lesbian photographers in London during the 1980s and 90s. And so what I want to kind of do in the next 20 minutes is think about the way that debates around the meaning of documentary in the 1980s were articulated or exploited in the service of articulating a queer position in the 1990s. And I should say before I begin that my thoughts here are really reflective of ongoing collaborations and conversations within what is a really vibrant field of research at the moment. So scholars like Theo Gordon, Laura Guy, Fiona Anderson, Greg Salter, and Francesco Ventrella have all been kind of feeding into this work in various ways. So I want to begin by looking at this object. This is a 1986 issue of the magazine Creative Camera. Inside is a roundtable discussion titled, What is the Status and Future of Documentary Photography in Britain in the 80s? And this roundtable has been pretty crucial to my thinking over the last 5 or so years as I've been kind of working towards this book, which is based on my PhD. Much of my work centers on the photographer Tessa Boffin, and I first encountered a Xerox of this piece, which you can see on the right, also referred to as the Documentary Forum, in her archive at UCA Rochester. And so at the time I was kind of on a fact-finding mission. I was trying to figure out what would be useful for my research, and I sort of noted this Xerox and set it aside. And you can see here as well the cover of the magazine. But this article has kind of unexpectedly boomeranged towards me again and again. I think partly because it's a remarkably strange document, and partly because that strangeness makes it really rich. The documentary Forum was published 4 years after Victor Bergen's seminal anthology, Thinking Photography, which Bergen described as a collection towards, rather than of, photography theory. And that comment is something else that's really key to my thinking. There's aliveness in the way that Bergen opens the book, with its reminder that the central topic, photo theory, wasn't yet fully formed. The conversations which Bergen and others were having in writing, at talks and conferences like this one, at institutions like the Polytechnic of Central London, where Bergen taught, these conversations were part of an ongoing negotiation of photography's artistic status and political potential. And I think it's John Tagg who has written about the cover of this book. So there's this kind of stack of volumes, which includes Walter Benjamin, Ellen Trachtenberg's classic essays on photography, Victor Shklovsky, Robert Frank's The Americans, and then on top of the stack is a camera. So the cover kind of gestures towards a particular intellectual genealogy, but also emphasizes the intertwining of theory and practice, which stems from it. So for Bergen, this negotiation was formed partly in opposition to what he termed a sociological approach to documentary, photography as evidence, or as the kind of image which would solicit, in Alan Sekula's terms, empathy rather than solidarity. By way of an alternative, Thinking Photography draws on the contemporaneous language of feminist organizing, while famously excluding the voices of feminists, and calls for a politics of representation staked against this sociological approach. The politics of representation is something like an expanded field. Who takes a photograph and why? What tools do they have and why? Where is the photograph shown and why? And most importantly, what ideological agenda does this serve, implicitly or explicitly, and why? This relentless interrogation was at the heart of photo theory. And as Evelyn noted on day 2 of this conference, the exchange which Tessa Boffin had with Suzanne Kapler in Feminist Review is a really potent illustration of how this politics of representation differs from a head-on representation of politics. And this is another event which is really key to my thinking. In that volley of letters, Boffin writes that she doesn't just take photographs of feminists or of feminist events. Rather, she claims to be making work which seeks to engage with representation on a more kind of granular level. So work which is within representation, as she puts it. John Tagg has reflected that photo theory was conceived of as the first brick to be thrown in smashing a stultifying state of political affairs, one upheld by documentary's purported neutrality. Simon Watney has reflected that photo theory paralyzed photography students and overemphasized theory at the expense of practice. And I think following Watney, we might then think of the camera here not as sitting atop the stack of books, but as hemmed in by them. So theory kind of directing and curtailing practice. In the wake of Thinking Photography's intervention, Creative Camera's documentary Forum reads less as a forum, a conversation, and more as a deadlock. To its umbrella questions are stacked atop each other, printed in dense columns of text, which you can see here. So there's no back and forth, just successive opinions, which often turn out to be polarized. The respondents are diverse. We hear from pictures editors, a Magnum photographer, the head of art at Goldsmiths, and from Joe Spence and Simon Watney. Spence and Watney were friends and collaborators, as Jackson Davidaw discussed on day 2. Watney at one time a lecturer at PCL alongside Bergen, and Spence a mature student. So there's a real range to the pulse which the forum takes. We have practitioners, lecturers, curators, editors, all answering to this question with different stakes and from different angles, which serves to augment the sense of identity crisis that the forum becomes wrapped up in. Performing this conflict over the meaning and import of documentary, the forum spills out from the renegotiation of photography's aims, which Bergen had gestured towards in 1982, and which feels here as unresolved as it had 4 years prior, still reaching towards something, or perhaps more accurately, towards various things. Colin Jacobson, the Observer's pictures editor, writes that, quote, "We all know there are pictures editors and designers dying to publish straightforward, old-fashioned documentary stories. Meanwhile, young and not so young photographers get better and better at handling tricky studio lighting. So here, documentary is left unchallenged. It's understood not just as old-fashioned, but good old-fashioned. 10 lines down the page, Maggie Murray, who is a key figure in the women's photography agency format, which we've heard about a few times, writes that as a description, the term documentary photography has become rather overloaded and self-important, making claims for truth and universal significance which can no longer be supported. So Murray is also kind of positioning herself against this sociological approach, which Bergen discusses, which is the approach that Jacobson seems to advocate for. Over the Fold, the photographer Joe Spence distills this friction into two schools: found documentary of the sort celebrated by Magnum, and constructed documentary of the sort taught at PCL. Spence writes that they are both churning out very good stuff, still both convinced that they are right and having very little to do with each other. I speak of the old guard who still take pictures to be inserted into holes, under which words appear, which purport to tell us what the pictures mean. I also speak of the avant-garde, that hard-working band of theoreticians who make pictures with which tangential text appears, text which addresses the subtexts that those other people's texts don't reach. What is the onlooker to make of all this, she asks. Who are all these pictures for? A theme which has recurred over the last 3 days of this conference, especially on day 2, I think, is the role that photography has played, whether it wants to or not, in refiguring the social. And this is where I now want to take this paper. Spence asked, who are all these pictures for? Like the forum itself, this question has a multitude of answers, I think. In refiguring documentary, in puncturing its claims to truth and universality, the subject at the receiving end of all these pictures became more easily specified. And in receiving a new kind of picture, one which didn't just show them the world, but deliberately placed them within it, the possibilities that that world could then hold were more easily imagined and discharged. Abigail Solomon Godot has provocatively written that just about every photograph can be seen as documentary, while by the same token, just about none can. Solomon Godot goes to the heart of the problem, which is fundamentally ontological. What is a photograph? How do we classify these objects and make sense of them, right? And these questions have been simmering under or at times very much at the surface of photographic discourse since the technology was made public in the 1800s. The question of what is or isn't documentary, what its status and future are. These are questions about photography more fundamentally. But what I want to draw your attention to is the fact that these questions mirror other notable instances where boundaries have been policed and definitions have been guarded. And I'm thinking, of course, about gender and sexuality. The porousness of queer, in terms of thinking about gender and sexuality together and apart, mirrored the terms of photography's ongoing crisis. So it's no surprise that while photo theory was being articulated in this moment, kind of in the mid to late 1980s, and the category documentary was being challenged, queer was also starting to take shape as a politics, an aesthetic, and a position to inhabit. There's something quite queer about photography and its relationship to ideas of truth, about how truth slips and slides across the medium, and the ways in which the technology can be manipulated or bent even, to destabilize what we thought we knew. One of documentary photography's futures was queer, and I'm by no means suggesting that this was its only outcome, but by the mid-90s, queer and queers were everywhere. And I would argue that, and especially in the UK, this was in part a result of the way that documentary had been challenged. I want to turn to 2 additional objects. And again, these are books which have been brought up across the conference. Theo Gordon's excellent paper this morning focused on ecstatic antibodies. So we have Ecstatic Antibodies Resisting the AIDS Mythology, which was published in 1990 by Sunil Gupta and Tessa Boffin, and Stolen Glances, Lesbians Take Photographs, which was published in 1991 by Boffin and Jean Fraser, and includes the work of Mumtaz Karimji, who Alice Correa discussed in her excellent paper. So These books, which were also exhibitions, as Theo talked about, are really key, I think, to understanding lesbian, gay, and ultimately queer representation in the UK during the 1990s. Not just in terms of the artists they gather and the material conditions which made these books possible, but in their framing and conception. In Ecstatic Antibodies, Boffin and Gupta explicitly cite Bergen's distinction, making clear that the project sought to make visible the communities underrepresented in mainstream AIDS discourse and which documentary work was erasing. And it's also important to note that Boffin was a student of Watney's at PCL. So there's a real kind of genealogy here, which extends as well to Sunil Gupta, which is part of the article that Amy mentioned in third text. In the introduction to Stolen Glances, Boffin and Fraser write that the title refers to the way in which lesbian photographers had started stealing from heterosexual imagery, manipulating its conventions to subvert their meaning and repurposing them to visualize dyke sensibilities and concerns. As noted here, this led to a focus on constructed and staged images at the expense of old-fashioned documentary ones. So who are all these pictures for, Spence wondered in 1986. The pictures are for queers or towards them. And this is something which Boffin noted after the fact. So she's quoted in Cherry Smith's volume, Lesbians Talk Queer Notions, as saying that, quote, we didn't call it queer at the time, but looking back on it, that's what it was. And this is kind of what I mean by refiguring the social, right? Debates around the meaning of documentary, which is part of a longer discussion around photography's relationship to the truth, facilitated projects like Ecstatic Antibodies and Stolen Glances, which in turn facilitated a proliferation of imagery, which now reads as queer, and which helped formalize a queer position and a queer aesthetic. So again, and I don't have time to really unpack the books in full, but we aren't talking about photos of queer people, but photographs which make queer possible, and many other kind of identity positions besides. We can look at Boffin's own work in Stolen Glances, a series titled The Night's Move, to see how this happens. The sequence of images is printed alongside an essay which explores the stakes of staging photography in the context of lesbian politics, and what it means to blur the lines between fact and fantasy when an identity has been made to thrive primarily on fantasy, the facts obscured by homophobic denial, aided by photographic exclusion. And this image illustrates what I mean about how the destabilization of documentary created cracks, which allowed for the visualization of new subject positions and ways of being. Because the angel reads as queer. And that's because of the harness, which became a signifier of queer as the 90s wound on. We wouldn't give this a second thought now, but more and more images like this were becoming accessible outside of kink communities. Predating Boffin's is an image like Hal Foster's Dominance from the series Gay Semiotics, where the harness kind of has to be explicitly explained. So the wider series, Gay Semiotics, maps the visual signifiers of gay subcultures, with the harness standing in 1977 as a niche accessory linked to male sexual perversion. The harness as signifier was adapted outside of this context. So we see it again in Della Grace Volcano's 1988 series, The Ceremony. By now, kind of 10 years on, it succeeded gay male and signifies lesbian sex radical identity. So lesbians who were pushing at the limits of what that word had been made to mean. And this is another piece which is printed in Stolen Glances, and one which was really hotly contested when it was printed in Volcano's own monograph, Love Bites. And interestingly, the terms of that debate, that contestation, centered on whether the images were real or staged. In that case, the distinction being kind of crucial to a feminist politics. We see the harness again jumping forward in a later work by Volcano, and here it's attached to perversity quite clearly. So not gay male or lesbian sex radical, but either or. In each photo, the harness means something: gay BDSM, radical dyke, generic pervert, queer. So the harness is a deliberate prop in the staging, one which identifies the subject who wears it and perhaps interpolates the viewer. Boffin writes in Stolen Glances, We have to produce ourselves through representations in the present, here and now. And part of this entails drawing from what is visible, in this case, I think a photo like Fisher's. But what Boffin suggests in her repurposing of gay iconography is that a queer image can't be produced by drawing solely from fact. Who mobilizes our desires and fantasies, given that they cut across the fragile boundaries of sexual identity and gender, she asks. And this links back to Spence's question, I think, who are these pictures for? And I mentioned this previously, but I think that there's something happening here with the sort of devaluation of documentary, allowing for both a more specific subject who receives the image, but also a more tailored image in the first place, one which answers to this question of mobilizing desire. So none of these photos are old-fashioned documentary, but the nebulous truth value of photography pulls each one into its orbit, expanding the available visual repertoire and calling attention to the limits of what had existed before. Just about all of these photographs are documentary, but at the same time, just about none of them are. And this is what Stolen Glances kind of ultimately accomplishes. Photographs like Boffin's and Volcanoes and Mumtaz Karimji's indeed exploit the medium to, quote, celebrate that there's no natural sexuality at all. So this is one instance where we can kind of track what documentary photography moves towards in the wake of its collapse, not found photos of queers in harnesses, which perhaps didn't yet exist, but photos which stage the harness as a signifier of queer desire and open onto the possibility of then inhabiting this position in the spaces of real life. And if anything, this was too successful. So like I said, we wouldn't give a second kind of thought to reading these photos as queer now, but there's this amazing quote also in Lesbians Talk Queer Issues where someone says, it's important that nobody starts saying you're not queer because you're not into leather and don't fuck in a harness. So this very much takes off and kind of assumes a life of its own. I want to finish by thinking briefly about queer photography's futures and turn back to a tantalizing moment in the Spence quote, which I offered earlier, where she describes straightforward documentary as pictures to be inserted into holes. She's referring, of course, to the gaps in newsprint left for the all-important confirmatory image. But thinking about this strategy of staging in order to create a different kind of documentation, I wonder if Spence's description can't also be repurposed to mean something else. Pictures inserted into holes, instead gesturing towards an approach to representation which calls the viewer and which insists on the erotics of queer desire lost when theory overtakes practice or when documentary fails to capture the moments where a more corporeal truth resides. Photography which mobilizes desire, in Boffin's words. Boffin's piece for Ecstatic Antibodies is a series titled Angelic Rebels, which we've heard about in a few papers. Again, we see the figure of a queer angel identified by a harness, which also serves as a grip for the sex radical dyke underneath her, who also wears a harness and has a different kind of harness at her feet. In the text which accompanies this piece, Boffin wrote that lesbians have remained virtually invisible in the crisis AIDS has engendered in representation. If AIDS was itself unrepresentable or only representable on the terms of mainstream media, then lesbian sex, already invisible, was made doubly so in conversations about transmission and care. And as many of you will know, I'm sure, this erasure was recently repeated by Russell T Davies' television series, It's a Sin. So the kind of key female protagonist isn't allowed a sexuality. We could imagine that she's a lesbian, but regardless, this character, Jill, is offered up as a kind of desexed caretaker. And this desexing, as many people have written, serves to exacerbate the pernicious idea that women, lesbians, don't contract HIV. So in seeking to kind of replicate the feel, the trauma, the dynamic of the AIDS epidemic in what is, of course, a staging in and of itself, I think Russell T Davies kind of makes a crucial mistake, misses a trick, which is that he trusts the sort of surface narrative at the expense of those which it's sidelined, right? Works like Boffin's, which were kind of trying to bring that sideline into focus. The narratives which Ecstatic Antibodies was trying to foreground. So what would the series, what would It's a Sin, and this is sort of a general question that I've been thinking of recently, what would it have looked like if it drew not from the pictures which were taken to be inserted into holes, as Spence writes, but the photographs which were made against them, which can perhaps be read through a slightly different understanding of that quote. Photographs like this one, which work within representation and offer a different understanding of pictures and wholes altogether. And here I've been thinking about Dominic Johnson's really brilliant essay on the significance of the harness in Della Grace Volcano's later work. So the whole is a kind of queer punctum. When I was wording the title of this paper, I followed that of the documentary forum, leaving the question in an ambiguous tense, which muddies the distinction between past, present, and future. What is the status and future of queer photography in Britain in the 80s? The future towards which work like Boffin's pointed has in some ways been realized, right? So we can kind of see this in the ubiquity of the harness as a signifier of queer. But in other ways, popular approaches to queer representation seem to be stuck in the representation of politics, which Boffin and others warned against. Both the meaning of documentary photography and the meaning of queer were, and still are, ambiguous and in process. So the question then is, I think, what are we now moving towards? And how can we use this work to mobilize a politics of representation, which is also a politics of desire? Thank you.
Thank you so much, Flora. That was great. There were some really, really provocative things there, and I think there's lots of kind of interesting discussions around forums and collectivity and kind of counter publics from other papers that we can draw out in the conversation. So our next speaker, though, is Victoria Horn, who will present a paper titled Reading Aesthetics, Magazines in the Women's Art Movement. Victoria is a senior lecturer in art and design history at Northumbria University, Newcastle. Her writing has been included in Art History, Feminist Review, Journal of Art Historiography, Third Text, and the Journal of Visual Culture. She's also the editor of Danger Women Reading, Feminist Encounters with Art, History, and Theory, published by Women: A Cultural Review in 2019, which actually includes a number of our contributors. So I do encourage you to check out that special issue. And she's also a co-editor of the important collection Feminism and Art History Now, which came out in 2017. And again, I think there's a few of us in that volume too. So I'll now pass over to Victoria.
Thanks, Amy. Just checking you can see my PowerPoint okay?
Yes, it looks great.
Cool. Thank you. In 2010, the journalist and activist Beatrix Campbell recalled, "We ate the literature that was pouring out of the women's liberation movement. We ate it. It was an extraordinary relationship to the written word. All of these tracts and texts and books we consumed as soon as they came out. And whether you were an intellectual or not, you just read everything, and it impacted massively on your life." In 1996, Griselda Pollock had also looked back to that period and commented, "Such knowledge as British feminists acquired in the early 1970s was procured by our forming reading groups and collectives, established in the radical tradition of workers' self-help groups and feminist consciousness raising. We formed reading groups to study Marx, Lacan and Foucault. We read magazines like Screen, New Left Review and Red Rag. A combination of collective self-help and intellectual bricolage re-educated a range of activists and intellectuals. There were enough books, few though there were, to begin to guide us to others." And in 1994, Linda Nochlin described a transformative night of reading magazines until 2 a.m, making discovery after discovery, cartoonish light bulbs going off in my head at a frantic pace. I started reading and I couldn't stop. I recite these words here because they so evocatively underscore the energetic reading activities associated with the women's liberation and art movements of the 1970s and 1980s. It is evident, I think, from these and other reminiscences How much was invested in readerly processes of self-education, and to what extent reading pamphlets, periodicals and newsletters could generate passionate reactions and enthusiastic solidarities. Reading is not ahistorical. It is an activity shaped by numerous psychological and social forces. And in this short paper, I want to explore the distinctive grassroots reading culture of UK second wave feminism and start to unpack how it was represented and mediated through visual art of the period. My presentation won't bear much or any really resemblance to the abstract I proposed last winter, and I apologise for that. This paper is part of a larger project I'm working on about a history of feminist art magazines. However, in these months of national lockdown, unable to travel and engage with those materials directly, I've been encouraged to think more creatively about how reading figured in the feminist imagination of that period. This discussion will therefore gesture towards the independent publishing culture and reader networks that fueled the feminist artistic communities of late 20th century Britain, and trace the role of representation in consolidating certain values and practices. My periodical research has focused primarily on feminist arts news, which has been mentioned and quoted from a few times already today, but about whose readers we know very little, given the paucity of records. There were several hundred subscribers at any time and around 2,000 copies distributed. But one detail that I found especially intriguing, and which might be useful to bear in mind here, is how the notices and editorials within the magazine on occasion publicised reading sessions, so that the artists, educators, curators and writers who constituted the magazine's readership could gather to collectively discuss recently published issues and plan for those in future. In this way, the editors emphasised processes and conversations around publishing production, rather than focusing on the finished product. And these invitations reveal a serious ambition to open up the fairly solitary act of reading to building a community. Although exact details about fan circulation are unclear, part of this project of reconstruction has been to creatively imagine its reading milieu. The magazine's back pages listed distributors, bookshops and galleries, mostly within the UK and Ireland, but also further afield in Sweden, Canada and Australia. Readers may have picked up a recent issue for 60p at one of these independent shops, at a discussion session, or even at one launch event at the ICA. We can imagine that dog-eared copy being left next to the kettle in a shared studio space, picked up by other interested artists, or passed among friends and discussed in living rooms or across kitchen tables. Although a lot has been written in recent years about the discursive small group politics of 70s feminism, I believe there's much more room for further material study of the print publications that often sparked these engagements. And I won't say too much about the specifics of FAN in this paper, but I'm very happy to discuss it afterwards if anyone has any questions. A few weeks ago at a talk given by Katherine Grant, I was really struck by a clip that she showed from a 1984 Channel 4 documentary about women filmmakers. And I'd really hope to share this clip today, but unfortunately it wasn't possible. The 4-minute segment, which you can see a still from here, shows a figure that I assume is the filmmaker Joanna Davis, perched on a high stool, leafing through and reading the pages of a hardbound book, as slides from her 1979 film, often during the day, are projected on and behind her. Now, this striking visual collage caught my attention because of how it complexly layers different modes of reading. Davis's original film is about the gendered politics of housework, and in it, we watch fragmented scenes of a kitchen, especially those nooks and crannies in which dirt gets trapped, liquid spills, and a voiceover recounts the repetitive actions of cleaning those same spots again and again, day after day. However, these images of kitchen surfaces are interrupted by excerpts from Anne Oakley's influential 1974 study, The Sociology of Housework, pages of which appear on screen, often for a notable duration, with passages marked for attention, sometimes shown in silence, and sometimes commented upon by the film's narration. Through this collaging of text and image, Davis invites the audience to join her in reading and thinking through Oakley's written study in order to better understand the conditions of housework that the film visually arrests and investigates. In this manner, Davis's film goes some way towards reenacting and extending the reading groups and consciousness-raising sessions associated with second wave feminism. Distributed by circles and screened at avant-garde and feminist film festivals, we can imagine the cinema audience transformed into an impromptu study group. Of course, the 1970s and 80s were marked by a diffuse conceptualization of reading as the post-structuralist cultural turn recast objects, experiences, and even subjects as texts to be read. But I want to suggest it means something more specific for politicized feminist readers of the period. And indeed, the reframing of Often During the Day within Margaret Williams' documentary spotlights the act of reading in ways that support this suggestion. Moreover, Williams' camera repeatedly captures scenes of women talking together around tables cluttered with papers, documents, and study materials. These pictures are only indicative, they're not stills from the documentary. And of course, that figure is framed with a book on a stool amidst the projected glimpses of the kitchen and pages of a sociological study. And this particular setup may have been staged for the documentary, or it could have been a live performance. I'm not entirely sure yet. Either way, both Williams's documentary and Davis's film are deliberate in foregrounding the act of reading. And here I could also have mentioned or talked about Liz Rhodes' film Light Reading, which was also, she was also a filmmaker included in that documentary. So in thinking about this subject, I turned to Katherine Brown's excellent book, Women Readers in French Painting, 1870 to 1890. In it, she examines why so many artists over that 20-year period experimented repeatedly with the theme of reading women. Brown suggests that it was partly the result of rapidly rising literacy levels, and because, and I quote, "An open book was an effective way of communicating information about a woman's intellect, social standing, personal relationships, and private morality. Artists and their audiences understood women readers to be easily legible figures, recognizable from a wealth of visual clues that symbolized the physical and imaginative world they inhabited." This visual coding has evolved, but a book's connotative power remains. Indeed, Katie Halsey has described reading as a kind of self-fashioning, because, as she puts it, the material someone reads can be used as a sort of shorthand to describe the kind of person they are. So it is wise to be wary of such descriptions. While they may well be true, they may not tell the whole truth. End quote. People often narrativize, distort, or even lie about their reading practices. And scholars have commented on the complications that this intense mediation presents to the assessment of reading histories. So in thinking about creative ways into the past, artworks as visual fictions might tell us something about how the act of reading was conceptualized and negotiated within specific milieu. In this case, a group of highly self-conscious readers, the feminist identified artists, scholars, and curators who constituted the periodical networks I'm examining. So to go back to Brown, she tells us, and I quote, 19th century commentators agreed that unsupervised reading was thought capable of distorting women's view of their world and their place in it, by encouraging unrealizable fantasies or stimulating a political voice, literacy had the potential to destabilise a domestic regime in which women's role had hitherto been clearly articulated and understood. Extending this logic, by the 1970s, a sharply politicised feminist audience could apprehend their readerly acts in subversive or resistant ways. And indeed, Davis's film, with its snippets of sociological reading or sociological text, evidences reading's destabilising effect on domestic subjectivity a full century later. Moreover, scholars including Rolf Foster and Victoria Bazin have emphasised the effects of periodical production and readership in the construction of collective political identities. Through reading these magazines, individuals came to feel and act as part of a grassroots network. Bazin also usefully notes that if activist agency is produced through the production and consumption of activist magazines, then these papers might provide ways of thinking about feminist agency beyond the identification of women as the subject of feminism. So in the right circumstances, that's to say that reading can have destabilising or activating effects on its subjects. Katherine Brown examines painterly representations of reading in France from 1870 to 1890, because this was a crucial period of transition in women's literacy and reading habits across social classes. Comparatively, the historian Eve Worth has studied women's education and social mobility in Britain during the long 1970s. And she examines the particular importance for post-war women of the Labour government's expansion of further education and creation of the polytechnics, a new layer of public sector higher education in the mid to late 1960s. And I won't get into the nuances of her argument today, but she relays this astonishing statistic. Between 1971 and 1981, the total number of the female population with qualifications increased by 50%. This was therefore a period in which, and I quote, the expansion of the welfare state opened up new educational and occupational opportunities for women, which had ongoing effects on their material circumstances and sense of self, end quote. We can now take a historical view of those decades of the feminist art movement and its intellectual transformations and failures, and situate those in relation to, albeit uneven, changes to women's social, educational, and economic position. It is not accidental that images of readers or acts of reading are frequently staged in visual art from the 1970s onwards, nor that leading feminist intellectuals reminisce about reading groups and photocopied tracts passed among friends. These cultural mediations were deeply interwoven with the opportunities afforded by an expansion of higher education that came prior to, although complexly paved the way for, the competitive post-feminist top girls of the late 90s that Angela McRobbie has so sharply described. I have only started exploring the significance of imagery, its reception and impact on feminist social relations, and Alice's paper earlier in this session was interestingly similar in this regard. But I want to consider what distinguishes or connects readerly artworks as diverse as, for example, Mary Kelly's annotated study of Lacanian psychoanalysis and postpartum document, Rita Donna's sustained intervention into media representations of Northern Ireland, Martha Rosler's deconstructive reading of Vogue in a video performance, or Jo Spence's photographic self-portrait reading Freud. Despite wildly differing aesthetic aims and strategies, these and many other works represent or invite acts of feminist reading. And we can situate this within a longer representational tradition of women readers described by scholars such as Brown. And in relation to my study of magazines, I want to propose reading as a productive frame for conceptualizing the artistic, intellectual and political work of the UK feminist movement, one which, as I've said, can be situated in this kind of longue durée of women, art and reading. The periodical networks that my and others' research traces, those networks between artists, writers, historians, and the artistic, critical, and curatorial spaces they supported and mediated flourished only because those involved could imagine and see themselves, that is, they could self-reflexively understand themselves as critical readers of an intellectual tradition who were unwilling to treat art production and art history as neutral practice or discipline. So on that note, I want to finish with another artwork, and it's one that you'll all be very familiar with, Lubena Hamid's painting of 1991, Between the Two, My Heart is Balanced. This painting has received well-known art historical attention in the 1990s from Jane Beckett, Deborah Cherry, and Griselda Pollock, whilst Alexandra Kekuli and Dorothy Price have returned to it more recently. Hamid is particularly relevant for my study as she wrote for Feminist Arts News, and she co-edited a special issue with Maud Salter in 1988 about Black women's creativity. And in fact, after relaunching, after a brief hiatus in the early 1980s, Fan was much more attentive to what they termed communities of difference. So in its first iteration, the magazine really themed its issues around kind of formal themes in art or art spaces. But in its later years, it focused its issues on themes such as race and representation, disability, working class and older women in the arts, Irish arts and post-colonialism. And in this refocusing of attention, it mirrors wider trends in feminist publishing, such as in the popular and much commented upon Spare Rib magazine. And as Kekuli has discussed, Hamid's painting was reproduced on the cover of a reissue of Framing Feminism. So this is just to say that the painting and Hamid's practice is materially embedded in feminist publishing histories. The large acrylic painting obviously differs from the non-figurative scripto-visual work that I've kind of already discussed. But again, it represents a scene of reading or of subversive non-reading or post-reading. The two figures flank a tall stack of colourful maps. The map's pages are characterised by imminence, earthbound, confined by the height of the horizon, while a sliver of sky can be glimpsed, open and promising above. The figure in profile uses one hand to leaf the sheets, her other free hand hovering overboard to scatter ripped pages on the tides. The companion figure plays torn shreds of the maps between her hands. As a narrative history painting, it invites the viewer to read its meanings. And on one level, the artwork reflexively performs a recitation of British Victorian history by referring to a Tissot painting of the 1870s, thereby foregrounding Hamid's intellectual and artistic labour as a Black woman artist negotiating the weight of that tradition, a differencing of the canon in Pollock's influential terms. But it also literally suggests reading in the stack of maps. Maps, of course, indicate knowledge and control. In the hands of these two figures specifically, these papers indicate the colonial impetus that fueled the destructive mapping of lands across Africa and the Indian subcontinent. But these figures are defiantly shredding and tossing the pages. As Salter and Hamid write in their special issue of Fan, our course is self-determined. As family, no maps. Kekuli describes the replacement of an earlier photographic work on the cover of Framing Feminism with Between the Two, My Heart is Balanced as a protest against and simultaneously a monument to uncomfortable truth. That is, of course, the erasure or neglect of Black voices in 1970s and 80s feminist discourse. In both form and content, Between the Two constitutes a readerly revision of the British art histories preceding it, including those within dominantly white feminist art practice and theory as it took increasingly calcified forms. But it is a hopeful image in that the figures are tearing up maps, charting a new course, resistant readers of art's many histories. Thank you.